Hi everyone! Today I'm going to be presenting variations in the life histories of incarcerated parents by race and ethnicity, and the implications for service provision. This study was conducted by Keva M. Miller, J. Mark Eddy, Sharon Borja, and Sarah R. Lazari. Just a quick overview of the study before we get into it. This study examines variations in the life histories of incarcerated mothers and fathers and how their lifetime experiences compare based on their race and ethnicity. The study examined 5 areas of their life history: exposure to trauma, child welfare involvement, mental health and substance abuse problems, juvenile justice and adult criminal justice involvement, and intergenerational criminal justice involvement. You may be asking yourself, why is this research so important to us? Many of you might know that the US has the highest incarceration rate in the world, with nearly 2.2 million people incarcerated in the United States today. The majority of these incarcerated individuals are parents to children who they lived with prior to their incarceration, still have contact with, and will most likely return to following their release. Many incarcerated mothers and fathers have a lifetime history of violence, abuse, substance abuse, mental health issues, and other problems, all of which increase their risk of reincarceration. This puts their children at a greater risk of both immediate and long-term problems. Just a little bit of background information before we go any further. We're going to start with the first area that the researchers were interested in, which is a history of childhood exposure to trauma. This is prevalent among incarcerated populations, with 60% of incarcerated women and 45% of incarcerated men reporting childhood trauma. Whites reported higher prevalence than African Americans, Latinos, and American Indians. Traumatic childhood experiences may have led to childhood welfare involvement, and we know from our previous readings that children of color are disproportionately represented in the child welfare system, with African American children being represented at a much higher rate than white children. The second area of study is adult exposure trauma, which is also very common among incarcerated individuals. Between 43 and 92% of men and 60 and 99% of women are part of adult exposure to trauma. Partner violence is the most common form of trauma in adulthood. Mental health and substance abuse problems are often associated with lifetime trauma beginning in childhood. These issues that started in childhood may even be exacerbated by incarceration. Childhood exposure to trauma and mental health and substance abuse problems are common predictors for criminal activity and juvenile justice system involvement. Youth of color, again, are disproportionately represented in all stages of the justice system engagement. African American youth are 123% more likely to be arrested, 43% more likely to be detained, and 23% more likely to be placed in secure facilities. Intergenerational incarceration is of particular concern for communities of color. Now, there's not a ton of research on intergenerational incarceration, but it appears that there might be a correlation between child and parent incarceration, saying that children who have parents that are part of the justice system at some point are possibly more likely to be involved in the juvenile justice system or part of the criminal justice system at some point in their own lifetimes. The purpose of the study was to build upon prior literature and research to explore the life histories of incarcerated mothers and fathers and how their experiences are varied based on their race and ethnicity. Moving on to the methods used in this study, we'll start with participants. Data came from the initial assessment of the parent-child study, which is a randomized control of parenting inside out, which is PIO for short. PIO is a cognitive behavioral parent management training program for incarcerated mothers and fathers, which is psychologically based. The study took place within 4 facilities operated by the Oregon Department of Corrections. Participants had to be parents who had both past and current connection to their children. For this sample, women and racial ethnic minority inmates were oversampled to raise representation of these groups. Their goal was to have 50% women and 50% racial ethnic minority. They ended up with 359 participants from DOC facilities, and 54% were female, 46% were male. The racial breakdown was 59% white, 14% African American, 11% multiracial, 8% Native American, and 7% Hispanic white. In the month prior to their incarceration, 35% of parents had lived with their children full-time, 9% part-time, 18% visited their children at least once a week, 14% had visited less than once a week, and the rest had little to no contact. There were quite a few things that participants had to be eligible for to participate in the study. Participants were required to have at least one child aged 3 to 11 years old, the legal right to contact their child. They had to have some role in parenting their child in the past, and they needed to expect such a role in the future following their release from prison. They must have not committed a crime against a child or any type of sex offense, and they needed to have contact information for the caregiver of at least one of the children. They also had to have less than 9 months remaining before the end of their prison sentence. Moving into the measures associated with this study, participants were individually randomized into 2 different conditions. The first condition was the PIO intervention condition, and the second condition was the services as usual condition, which was the control. At the initial assessment before intervention, participants in the 2 conditions were interviewed on 2 occasions on their history before and during prison, with an emphasis on their family relationships. Each of the dependent variables of interest were measured with single-item questions, and the independent variable, which is race and ethnicity, was coded based on self-identification of race and ethnicity. The results of this study are seemingly kind of confusing when you're first looking at them in the paper, but once you break it down, it's actually pretty outstanding. Now, the results section starts off by saying that few of the tests conducted were significant, which is kind of alarming at first until you read further. Now, this actually suggests that within sex, the members of racial and ethnic minorities are pretty similar to each other in terms of their life history. That's important when we get to the discussion, so I'll talk about that later. But women appeared to be more similar to each other than men as well. Now, for men, race and ethnicity was related to the dependent variable of experienced drug and alcohol addiction, with whites being above average. Also spent time in residential treatment center, with whites higher and African Americans lower than the average. Spent time in residential treatment during adolescence, whites higher, African Americans lower, and detained by police and spent time in lockup as a juvenile, which was less than average for Latinos. For women, the one significant test examined the relationship between race and ethnicity and ever diagnosed with a mental problem. The value was greater than average for African American women. For men, this test was also significant, with whites being greater than average and Latinos less than average. Furthermore, for men, white men had problems in a variety of areas. African American men were most notable for involvement in the justice system as juveniles and adults. American Indian men were most notable for mental health problems and trauma, and Latino men had the lowest scores on all variables except drug and alcohol addiction. For women, there was a lack of significant findings. As I said before, women tended to be more similar than men in terms of their life history. And each group had some of the lowest and highest values for several variables, so it was kind of hard to make assumptions based on that. Moving into the discussion, many similarities in the life histories of incarcerated parents were found, especially among mothers. The study's findings replicate a variety of prior findings. Multi-system involvement, combined with the observed intergenerational pattern of incarceration and the short and long-term consequences of such among these subpopulations, show the high risk that children of incarcerated parents face. Incarcerated parents' life histories may vary to some degree by race and ethnicity, but only to the extent that they are related to issues that are experienced widely within their racial and ethnic group. The results of this study were not all that surprising for the researchers. There were few unexpected findings that relate to race and ethnicity. Implications for future research. Findings point to a limited number of pathways that lead to criminal justice system involvement, This can point us in a direction that may help to solve mass incarceration in the US by showing us the pathways that do lead to criminal justice system involvement and how to stop them. People of color are overrepresented in the criminal justice system and child welfare system. Future research should seek to examine how race poses increased risks for system involvement. Prevention programs have great potential to reduce numbers of families and children in need of resource-intensive intervention, and to make a difference in the lives of children whose parents are incarcerated. Some of the limitations of this study include that the proportion of racial and ethnic groups used in this study is not reflective of incarcerated parents at a national level, so the results are not necessarily generalizable to the US as a whole. Secondly, participants were asked to recall life history retrospectively, so there could be issues with the details of the occurrence or when they happened. As a conclusion, all these findings demonstrate the critical need for preventative interventions for men and women that divert individuals from pathways associated with crime and the criminal justice system. That's all I have for you guys. I will share the slides on the discussion board as well, so you can print them out for studying purposes. And if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, feel free to leave them in the discussion thread. Thank you guys so much for watching.